to our national security. The Bureau of Industry and Security's role is more important than ever. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. There are members on both sides of this committee, and some that will show up as we move on, that have served in uniform in the U.S. military. And I think we can all attest to the fact that there are differences between actions taken by soldiers on the battlefield and decisions made by politicians on Pennsylvania Avenue. You all are the soldiers, and there are politicians on Pennsylvania Avenue above both of you. I look at the Bureau of Industry and Security in a similar way that I look at the battlefield. The Bureau of Industry and Security is tasked with keeping American technology out of the hands of our adversaries via export controls, and any failure to do so, in my estimation and in what I've looked at, is largely the fault of the Office of the President and their failure to use this tool and actually counter China with every mechanism that we have available to do so. In the 7 months since the first hearing, it's become more clear to me that the Biden administration has not adapted to the emerging Cold War that we have with China, and our country, in some circumstances, has become less safe. In August of this year, Huawei released its Mate 60 Pro phone, which uses a 7-nanometer chip made by SMIC. This is a highly advanced chip, making it incredibly likely that it was developed with American technology. And if true, SMIC acquired that technology because of President Biden's refusal to fully utilize the Bureau of Industry and Security and all of their capabilities to stop it. Unfortunately, that is not a surprise, given some of the things that we've seen under the Biden administration. The Bureau of Industry and Security has had a lax of approvals of licenses for American technology to both SMIC and Huawei. In one 3-month period, the Bureau of Industry and Security denied less than 10% of entity-listed People's Republic of China company license applications, and we consider that problematic. And we now know that these companies are intertwined with the Chinese Communist parties, and that means that the CCP has our technology and can use it to oppress its own citizens or to harm our citizens if they wish. In another example, in November of this year, BIS removed the Institute of Forensic Science, IFS, from its entity list. We will probably speak about this as this hearing goes on, potentially ending all export controls and opening the door for American tech to flow through the Institute for Forensic Science for the first time in 3 years. That could be problematic. For those who may not be familiar, the State Department found that the Institute of Forensic Science was implicated in human rights violations and abuses against Uyghurs. If true, it's another example of the Biden administration's willingness to appease the enemy, even if it means giving away our strategic advantage, one of our strategic advantages. Pushing for appeasement is one of the Chinese Communist Party's greatest tactics in stealing American technology, among the others that they use. As this committee's recent report detailed, the evidence has continued to mount. The Bureau of Industry and Security has a duty to set and enforce rules that protect American national security under the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. But under the Biden administration's leadership, there have been places that they have not executed this. Imagine if, at the height of the Cold War, news broke that the Soviet Union had developed and launched Sputnik thanks to stolen American technology. We would all consider that incredibly worrisome. That's not just a situation we could find ourselves in. It's a situation we did find ourselves in 10 months ago as a Chinese spy balloon floated across the continental United States, a spy balloon that used stolen American technology to spy on Americans. That balloon might as well have been designed like the Goodyear blimp with a sign on it that says where it was brought to you by. I look at this situation and I think that there is work that's being done, but I think that it can be done better. I think there are places that you are being restrained and held back, and it's to the detriment of our national security. Xi Jinping is gearing up for a fight. He's made that clear, and President Biden needs to match that commitment. I will just make one more analogy as it relates to export controls, and that is simply to say this. You could deny something to me and be effective in doing that. But if you gave that technology to one of my 4 children or gave it to my spouse, then you are essentially giving that technology to me because I can and will be able to get my hands on it. And I believe that that's the way that we need to more strictly look at China. We do a good job at looking at where this is taking place with, as we've discussed, things that go boom, things that explode. But we have to make sure that we're looking at every avenue that they could acquire any of our dual-use technologies and make sure we're examining, just because it's not an agency that necessarily uses items to make things go boom, that they're not taking that and getting it to one of the other members of their family. In that, I will conclude my remarks, and I will yield to Ranking Member Crow for any remarks that he may have. Mr. Crow, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Mast. Today we examine the U.S. export controls policy and significance for our national security and foreign policy. I welcome our witnesses as the 2 U.S. government officials most directly responsible for imposing and enforcing export controls, and I look forward to having a substantive discussion with both of you. We met in this subcommittee to discuss the Department of Commerce Bureau of Industry and Security several months ago, and a few themes emerged that these witnesses are particularly well suited to address. The first is that export controls are a powerful tool that can be used to cut off access to valuable American products and technologies that the PRC, Russia, Iran, and others would use to undermine U.S. security and commit human rights violations. The second is that the Biden administration and many in Congress support a more robust use of export controls. And the third is one of resourcing. BIS ensures that U.S. products and technologies are not used against us or our allies while safeguarding our economic strength in the private sector. Despite licensing requests doubling since 2010, BIS's budget for core export control activities has essentially been flat over the same time. Congress has not resourced BIS adequately. The Biden administration's use of export controls has been broad and historic in countering Russia and China, and more aggressive than any prior administration. A staggering 41% of the total number of entities listed on the entities list were added under this administration. And we have exercised global leadership as we counter these actors. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the administration built a coalition with 38 other countries imposing stringent export controls on Russia and Belarus, the largest and most coordinated effort of its kind outside of a multilateral regime and a model for future policymaking. The Biden administration listed hundreds of PRC-based entities and took unprecedented unilateral steps to restrict the PRC from obtaining technologies and tools in the advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing space. After implementing historic controls in October 2022, the administration persuaded critical allies like Japan and the Netherlands to impose their own controls, a development that helps multilateralize our policies on China. Congress's oversight of export control policy must assess balance. We cannot export sensitive and advanced critical technology to China that undermines our national security. At the same time, our controls must be targeted so they do not harm the U.S. economy and impede U.S. companies from becoming global leaders in these technologies. It's a delicate balancing act, but to win the strategic competition, it's critical that we do both. I look forward to the witnesses speaking to how the administration has advanced export control policy with this balance in mind. In closing, I want to acknowledge the majority's recently released report on BIS. This report makes a number of claims, some of which I believe are misleading, about BIS in the administration's export control record that are worth debating. Chief among these is an assertion that BIS's primary objective is to protect U.S. national security. The first statement of policy in the Export Control Reform Act of 2018 is, quote, to use export controls only after full consideration of the impact on the economy of the United States, end quote. Congress recognized that economic security requires safeguarding both our national security and our ability to be global leaders in innovation and technology. So with that in mind, I hope we can spend some time today on oversight discussions, including areas where BIS can improve, ways to advance long-term U.S. economic and technological superiority, strengthening coordination with partners and allies, and giving BIS the tools and resources it needs to enforce our policies effectively. With that, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Crow. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have two distinguished panel of witnesses before us today for this important topic. First, the Honorable Ms. Taya Kendler is the Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. She joined BIS as an experienced export controls, sanctions, and national security attorney, coming directly from the Department of Justice's National Security Division. Prior to this, she worked in the BIS's counsel office for 10 years. Next, we have the Honorable Matthew Axelrod. He's the Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Before his time at BIS, he spent over 13 years at the U.S. Department of Justice in numerous high-level roles and served as special counsel in the Office of the White House Counsel. We thank you both for being here today. Your full statements will be made a part of the record, and I'll ask that each of you keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for members to ask their questions. I now recognize you, Assistant Secretary Kendler, for your opening statement.
Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the Biden administration's ongoing efforts at the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security to advance U.S. national security and foreign policy interests by controlling exports and promoting continued U.S. strategic technology leadership. I appreciate the opportunity to work with you and your staff on these critical issues to ensure that we're effectively countering China's military modernization and human rights abuses, degrading Russia's ability to wage war on Ukraine, identifying and controlling technologies critical to protecting our national security, and collaborating with international allies and partners as we pursue these priorities. Through Export Administration's licensing officers, trade data and industry analysts, and our growing international policy and intelligence analysis teams, we identify sensitive U.S. technologies that would give our adversaries an advantage, and we develop the policies and strategies to protect such technologies. We assess the availability of foreign technology and the effectiveness of our controls, as well as foreign end users that require extra scrutiny. We then adopt export controls on both technology and end users. Technology controls are based on the performance specifications of an item. The controls put in place on advanced semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China are an example of this. By controlling items with the most advanced applications on a countrywide basis, we are able to deny the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the hardware necessary for advanced computing capacity it desires to train artificial intelligence models and for other military applications. We use end-user controls to deny items to particular entities. These controls are imposed when there are specific and articulable facts that an entity is engaged in activities contrary to U.S. national security or in foreign policy interests. Of the 787 PRC-based entities on the entity list, 303, or more than a third, have been added in the Biden administration. Together with our interagency partners in the Departments of Defense, Energy, and State, we have the serious responsibility of imposing technology and end-user controls, as well as reviewing license applications submitted by exporters to determine whether specific transactions are consistent with U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. Each of these agencies brings its unique expertise and understanding to the analysis, complemented by input from our intelligence community and law enforcement partners. All licensing decisions are made by the interagency in collaboration with each other. Export controls are not static. We must continually assess and refine our approach and our controls to maximize their impact. As noted in the Export Control Reform Act of 2018, our controls are more durable and more effective when opposed alongside international allies and partners. Let me share some actions that we've taken in these regards. This fall, we updated last year's artificial intelligence chips and semiconductor manufacturing controls to reflect our assessment of China's future advanced computing needs to support the PLA's military modernization. We're working with stakeholders now and welcome the continued engagement of this committee on a new approach to cloud computing controls as well. At the same time, we're carefully reviewing Russia's technology needs as it wages war on the innocent people of Ukraine. We have imposed sweeping export controls on Russia and Belarus and added to our comprehensive controls on Iran to choke off exports of technologies that support Russia's defense industrial base. While the impact of our export controls will only increase over time as Russia is unable to repair, replace, and replenish its military hardware, we are seeing substantial impacts of our actions in the data available to date. Just last week, we published a package of rules designed to increase collaboration with international allies and partners and streamline trade with these countries that share our approach to the advanced technology ecosystem. Our export controls work has never been more relevant or more effective. We are aggressively and appropriately contending with the strategic technology threats facing our nation and will continue to use all the tools at our disposal to counter efforts to outpace the United States and our allies. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Kendler. I now recognize Assistant Secretary Axelrod for your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Mast, Ranking Member Crow, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on our ongoing efforts to help deny nation-state adversaries access to sensitive U.S. technologies by enforcing U.S. export controls. As the Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement, I oversee a team of law enforcement agents and analysts who carry out a critical national security mission, keeping our country's most sensitive technologies out of the world's most dangerous hands. At no point in history has this mission been more important. As our intelligence community's most recent annual threat assessment notes on its very first page, quote, Russia is challenging the United States in some norms in the international order in its war of territorial aggression. China has the capability to directly attempt to alter the rules-based global order in every realm and across multiple regions. Iran will remain a regional menace with broader malign influence activities. And North Korea will expand its WMD capabilities while being a disruptive player on the regional and world stages. Here's what my team has been doing to meet this unprecedented national security moment. First, we've enhanced our enforcement policies to prioritize enforcement against the most pressing threats, including China, Russia, and Iran, while also incentivizing compliance and deterring violators. Second, we've expanded our partnerships at home and abroad to leverage resources that increase our effectiveness. And third, we've taken aggressive enforcement actions to impose real costs on those who seek to violate our rules and undermine our national security. On enforcement policies, we've acted to ensure that our finite resources are best positioned to have maximum national security impact. Last June, for example, we announced that we were raising penalties, prioritizing the most serious cases, eliminating no admit, no deny settlements, and making our administrative charging letters public when filed. Last October, we issued a policy announcing that when a foreign government fails to schedule our end-use checks in a timely way, we'll seek to move the unchecked parties onto our unverified list and then onto the entity list. In the year since the policy issue, we've completed over 130 checks in mainland China after 2 years of having been prevented from doing a single one. We've also changed how we track our investigative and analytic efforts so that we can best evaluate how close the fit is between our highest priorities and how we are spending most of our time. Next, partnerships. Given the scope of the threat we face in protecting U.S. technology from misappropriation, we must amplify our efforts through robust partnerships. It's why we joined with the Department of Justice, FBI, and HSI to form the Disruptive Technology Strike Force, which works to protect advanced U.S. technologies from being illicitly acquired by nation-state actors such as China, Russia, and Iran. We also have developed close partnerships with industry, academia through our Academic Outreach Initiative, the intelligence community, and Treasury components like OFAC and FinCEN. In the past year, we've put out multiple joint alerts and advisories with these partners designed to educate industry and academia on how best to comply with our rules and detect violations of them. We also work closely with our international counterparts to coordinate on enforcement. In fact, just last month, I traveled to Kyiv with Strike Force colleagues from DOJ and FBI. While there, we met with Ukrainian officials to discuss what more we can do to help degrade the Russian war machine. And finally, our enforcement actions. This past fiscal year, we had a record high number of both criminal convictions and administrative actions. Let me give you just a few examples. First, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've worked with DOJ and FBI to bring more than 10 separate indictments charging over 30 people for their role in procuring microelectronics and other dual-use items for the Russian military. Second, earlier this year, we announced a $300 million penalty against Seagate Technology for selling hard disk drives to Huawei, even after Seagate's only 2 competitors had stopped selling due to our foreign direct product rule. It's the largest standalone administrative penalty in our history, and it sends a clear message about the need for companies to comply with our rules and about the power of our administrative enforcement tools when they don't. And third, just last week, in a great example of our all-tools enforcement approach, DOJ unsealed 2 indictments against a Belgian national for allegedly exporting missile and drone components to China and Russia. We're working these cases alongside FBI, HSI, and other federal law enforcement partners. The defendant was also arrested by the Belgian government on charges there, placed on our entity list along with 5 related parties, and placed on the OFAC SDN list, all at the same time in a coordinated way across agencies and countries. Through our policies, our partnerships, and our enforcement actions, we continue to take impactful steps to protect our collective national security. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today about our work. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Axelrod. No matter what, I have to be here till the end, so I'm going to start by recognizing a few of my colleagues here. I'll recognize Mr. Mills, number 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I intend to be here as well to hear this through. I love the fact, and I just want to point out, Mr. Axelrod, that you're right in noting that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, their geopolitical alignment and looking at them from an adversarial perspective and not just a competitive perspective is certainly really where we need to be at right now. We know that the evolution of warfare is past and long since the days of just kinetics and really onto the economic resource supply chain and cyber-based warfare that we're all facing today. And we must be prepared for what that is to ensure that we're not transferring key data and that we're not allowing our innovations here at home to be utilized against us, as we've seen time and time again. I think we can all agree on the fact that one of the biggest human rights atrocities that we've seen in a very long time is what's been happening to the people who are the Uyghur. And the fact that they have not only been wrongfully imprisoned, sentenced to indentured servitude, had organ harvesting in some cases, many reports that had been back from women's prisons where they were being forcibly raped. These were all the horrendous incidents that's come to light, and we certainly want to do everything we can to make sure that these human rights violations don't occur. And knowing this, I wanted to kind of just touch on BIS's removal of IFS. As you know, IFS, the Institute of Foreign Science, collects Uyghur DNA to conduct biometric surveillance to imprison Uyghurs in camps. And so my question, I'll start with you, Ms. Kendler. Can you tell me why BIS removed IFS from the entity list on November 17, 2023?
Congressman, thank you for this question. I share your concern about the tragedy facing the Uyghur people. Human rights is a shared priority, certainly. I would add that the crisis facing our country from fentanyl is also a shared priority. Mm-hmm. The work that we have done to address fentanyl precursors with China will save lives. And it is because of that work, due to our, it became clear to us that including IFS on the Commerce Department's entity list was inhibiting the counter-narcotics action that was necessary.
And sorry to interrupt, but is this the Chinese argument where the Chinese have aggressively tried to state that since the National Laboratory for Narcotics is somewhat co-located, that we're going to acquiesce to China and go ahead and say that IFS therefore is somehow different? Is that the argument we're about to make here?
We've evaluated this issue, and we agreed to explore the potential of removing IFS from the entity list if China took major tangible action to address the flow of precursor chemicals to save American lives.
Even though we know that China right now is actually the leader and printing fentanyl in the Darien Gap and actually utilizing that to come into America to actually poison Americans, we're still going to go ahead and acquiesce to what China wants as opposed to what our own research has dictated?
China took tangible action in addressing fentanyl precursors, and there are four things that China.
What have they
agreed
done
to
to
do.
address their mainland Chinese who are in Darien Gap actually printing fentanyl right now? Or the fact that we actually stopped over 22 pill presses from going to them in South America in our own hemisphere? Have we done anything about that? Has that been an important step for us?
Congressman, we are addressing this issue, this crisis facing the United States across all areas of work in the Biden administration. Within the sphere of export controls, we are deeply
And
focused.
speaking about the president, if I may, is the president involved in entity list deliberations?
The four agencies that participate in these deliberations.
Because my understanding is
follow.
that the ECRA and the EAR is the president cannot be involved in entity listings to remove politics and maintain a neutrality of the tool, correct?
Congressman, a unanimous vote of the End User Review Committee is required to remove entities from the
Which
entity
means
list.
that a president who could potentially be corrupted and or compromised by the Chinese could actually help to influence the outcome of how BIS actually lists or delists companies?
Congressman, the department made the decision to remove IFS from the entity list, and I support that for national
And
security
did IS
reasons.
submit a request? And this is a simple yes or no. As the chair at ERC, and did BIS refer that request to other members per the regulations?
Congressman, I can't speak to that kind of specific information about a company, but I can assure you that no decision to remove a company from the End User Review, the entity list, would be made without unanimous agreement of the Departments of Defense, Energy, State, and Commerce.
Well, thank you so much for your testimony today. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mills. Now recognize Mr. Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to pick up on that line of questioning a little bit, because implied in that question, and a phrase that was used a couple of times, was this sense that there was acquiescence, that we simply acquiesced to the PRC. This is my time now. So I would like to just pull on that thread a little bit. We don't acquiesce to other countries. We have independent data. We have independent sources of getting information. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir. We, in the Commerce Department and with our interagency colleagues, we look at all sources of information in evaluating how best to protect U.S. national security and foreign policy. That's certainly open source and public information, but we rely very heavily on intelligence as well in our decision making.
Well, with what we can do in this room, because this is an open hearing, this is not a classified hearing, and we could obviously go much more into that in a classified setting. But in a non-classified setting, can you just provide more detail specifically as to, in an instance like this, what type of data and information would we independently rely on, not taking anyone's word for it, but what we rely on and making our assessment that this is in our best interests to protect the American people from the scourge of fentanyl by making this delisting decision that would help us better enforce our laws?
Sure, we would look at all sorts of activities associated with the impact of our export controls. We would look at how chemicals are moving and chemical fentanyl precursors are moving around the globe. The critical point here is that the United States is facing a national security crisis associated with fentanyl. And we have deep human rights concerns when it comes to China. And we have to address both of those concerns, which are shared priorities with the members of this committee. We have to address all of that at the same time. And sometimes that involves tough decisions.
Yeah, I understand. I get that point. I understand that. That's not the question I'm asking. Mr. Axelrod, perhaps you could weigh in here as well. What in your understanding, would we rely on when we make these independent decisions, not based on simple statements or certifications by other countries, but what information would we rely on in a delisting decision?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I think it's fair to say that there are whenever there's a delisting decision, it's a variety of factors come into play. In some circumstances, it can be more narrowly targeted to the particular entity and whether the particular entity has changed its behavior. In other circumstances, such as this one, the delisting decision can rely less on the specific entity that was delisted and more on other factors that also need to be taken into account. As Assistant Secretary Kendler was taking, 100,000 people are dying a year from fentanyl. I was a drug prosecutor in Miami, and I prosecuted the Cali cartel at its height. The Cali cartel was sending more cocaine into this country than anyone else ever in history, but cocaine wasn't killing people the way fentanyl is. We have to do everything in our power, use all our tools to help save American lives. This was a decision that we believe will help do that, and that's why it was done.
Okay. For either of you, how specifically, with detail, how specifically does the IFS's ability to help the PRC to track down the precursor chemicals that are coming into the United States or into Central and South America, then being produced into fentanyl, how does that delisting help track down those precursors?
I'm not sure it's as direct as that, Congressman. I think the issue here was that the listing of IFS was a consistent impediment to getting agreement from the Chinese to take specific actions to help with the fentanyl crisis, to help with the making sure that precursor chemicals weren't being sent from China. Here, the Chinese government agreed to take concrete action as part of this. We'll see what happens. They've already taken some. We'll continue to watch, but because the lab being co-located,
can you tell me what concrete actions?
Sure. Concretely, the PRC has taken law enforcement action against certain Chinese synthetic drug and chemical precursor suppliers, which has resulted in some of them stopping operations. In the first time in nearly 3 years, they've restarted submitting incidents to the International Ionics database, which allows international law enforcement to track shipments and intercept in real time. I believe they've also committed to providing a notice to their domestic industry, advising on the enforcement of laws and regulations related to fentanyl, which the last time they did that in 2019 led to a drastic reduction in seizures of fentanyl shipments from the U.S.
And we're going to monitor those things, right?
That's right.
And if they fail to follow through and comply with that, we can always add IFS back to the list. Is that right?
That's correct. Removal from the entity list is not a lifetime pass.
Okay, thank you. Go back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. Now recognize my friend, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quickly, Mr. Axelrod, what data exists that the IFS has stopped its behavior?
I don't believe there is such data, Congressman.
Okay.
I believe what I testified was that this was a different type of calculus. It wasn't that the activity had changed. It was that there was enough on the other side of the balance involving helping to save American lives from fentanyl.
Okay, let me switch gears here a little bit. The Bureau of Industry and Security recently announced a 90-day pause on firearms exports. Congressional staff was only given 1 hour notice. Why was not more time given to alert Congress?
Congressman, our pause on firearms licensing applies only to commercial entities outside of our close partner countries, including Israel and Ukraine. That temporary pause, which we're halfway through at this point, is based on national security and foreign policy considerations. And during this pause, we are using the time to figure out how best we can align our policy with our national security priorities.
I appreciate that, ma'am, but that wasn't my question. Why was not more time given to alert Congress about this? I think staff was given about 1 hour before the policy went into place.
Congressman, this is, if I may, this is not a policy. This is a temporary pause to reflect on our policy to make sure that we have it right. Given, sometimes our tech controls mean keeping advanced technologies away from China.
And why,
sometimes they mean human rights concerns.
Okay, well, why, you said you excluded Israel and Ukraine. Why was that?
We excluded our very close allies and partner countries, including Israel and Ukraine.
And why was that?
For the most part, it's because they have similar requirements in place for export controls on firearms and ammunition, similar to the United States, through the Wassenaar Arrangement, which is a multilateral regime that establishes the technical parameters for firearms controls.
Okay. It just seems to me you're kind of closing the barn door if they get attacked, and then we allow them, and then the others, if they get attacked, are they going to be allowed to, we're going to be able to, any other countries get attacked, are they going to be allowed to do this as well, or are we going to wait? I mean, it just seems to me that after they've already attacked, it's a little late to do this, is my point. You've excluded everybody but Israel and Ukraine.
We are continuing to license all applications. We're continuing to handle license applications that involve governments around the world.
Yes, ma'am, I appreciate that. But also, it appears y'all didn't have any conversations with stakeholders. You know, this isn't a Second Amendment issue, ma'am. This is a commerce issue. Firearms manufacturers have told me they were given no warning. And why were just the firearms industry, why were they singled out in this decision?
We're looking at this from national security and foreign policy angle. I would particularly point to our authorizing statute, ECRA, which calls that we look at regional stability issues. And particularly in the Western Hemisphere, we have gun violence issues that lead to regional instability. During the pause, we are very much consulting with stakeholders. We are holding meetings with industry.
But these people are in business, ma'am, and if you cut them off, government can just print more money, but these folks can't.
Well, NATO license applications are still being processed. Frankly, that's about 75% by value of our license applications that we are continuing to process.
Okay. Did anyone at the Department of Commerce have conversations with the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention prior to this decision?
We speak with the interagency about all licensing issues. As I noted, there are 4 agencies that work together by law intimately on export controls.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Now I yield to Mr. Kim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the two of you for coming before us. Assistant Secretary Axelrod, I wanted to start with you. I appreciated that you gave some texture in terms of some examples of enforcement that were taken, especially vis-a-vis the PRC and Russia. I was wondering if you might be able to go into, if you have any additional, I want to just kind of add some texture to be able to give people a sense of some of the range of what you're doing. In particular, I'm interested in anything regarding emerging technologies and components like that, but if you don't mind, kind of give us some greater sense of some of the things that you do.
Sure, thanks, Congressman. As I mentioned, we worked this year to establish the Disruptive Technology Strike Force with the Department of Justice. I co-lead it with the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and we have 14 operational cells located around the country. Unfortunately, not one in New Jersey, but we do have 2 close by in the southern and eastern districts of New York. And the idea there is to work with FBI and HSI and federal prosecutors to bring cases focused on these disruptive or emerging technologies. So let me give you one example. We announced the first wave of strike force cases back in May. In 2 of those cases, software engineers at American companies allegedly stole sensitive source code from their employers to send to China. In one case, the source code was for autonomous vehicle technology, and for the other, it was for metrology software, which is used in smart automotive manufacturing. So those are 2 examples. Those cases are pending, but I think through our strike force efforts, you're going to see more cases in the future involving emerging technologies.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. One thing that you mentioned that I'd like to get Assistant Secretary Kendler's thoughts on. You talked about the importance of partnerships across government, with industries, but you also made reference about partnerships internationally. And Assistant Secretary Kendler, I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this front. I think that there's a lot here that you're trying to deal with across the board, and I think that there could be a lot of importance when it comes to understanding that kind of international engagement. But My understanding is that we don't necessarily have a specific person who runs point on overseeing BIS's international coordination efforts. I could be wrong. I wanted a little bit more details on that front, but just what is it that we are doing, and whether or not something like that, some type of position that could be a quarterback there, thinking through how to harmonize policies with allies and partners, as well as thinking through how to just make sure we're coordinating and implementing the policies, especially vis-a-vis Russia and the PRC in a coordinated fashion. I wanted to get your thoughts on that kind of idea.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Whether we're aligning our controls through international export control coalitions or through sort of more informal plurilateral controls, we know that our controls are more effective when we work with allies and partners, when we evenly affect all relevant industry across the world. And so we have taken on new approaches to international partnerships. Starting with Russia, we've built the Global Export Control Coalition out of BIS, which is 38 major global economies coming together to deny Russia the same technologies. And building on that agile approach, that more nimble approach, we are now focused on more collaboration that's specific to the 21st century technology landscape. So I think we have an opportunity to build on that coalition. We have formal bilaterals with Europe through the TTC, Japan, Korea, and India. We have many more informal bilateral engagements.
I appreciate
and
that.
So we've started an office. We've started an Office of International Policy using our Ukraine funding, our supplemental funding, and we are building that into the team that you describe.
Appreciate that, and kind of thinking through that in terms of how we're resourcing and how we're funding this. Assistant Secretary Axelrod, everybody here is asking you all to do more because it's so important. And I know the Biden administration has put forward $222 million request in order to fund. We're having a lot of debates here about what that funding should look like, and right now the House Republican majority's put forward 14% cuts to the Department of Commerce. I just wanted to get a sense of what kind of impact that would have on BIS's work and what we would expect if that cuts went into effect.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Look, a cut to our budget would directly impact our national security work. It'll affect our ability to aggressively enforce the expanding controls that have been put in place on Russia and China. The Ukraine supplemental that you all were kind enough to pass gave us new resources that were added to our base in fiscal year 23, including 14 new special agents and 10 new intelligence analysts and support personnel. If we were to go back to our fiscal year 22 levels, it would cut 10% of our agents at a time when the need for more agents has never been higher. So I would urge the committee not to cut us. If anything, we can always do more with more.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Now going to yield to Mr. Moran for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Axelrod, I want to start with you, and then I'll come back in just a second to Ms. Kindler. The U.S. is the global leader in semiconductor equipment manufacturing, but other countries, including the Netherlands, Japan, South Korea, and Germany, are also critical providers of equipment and equipment components. Recently, reports have emerged that South Korean companies are providing spare parts to American equipment that's physically located in Chinese plants, which would, of course, be a violation of both U.S. intellectual property laws and U.S. export control regulations. What is BIS's plan for making existing U.S. export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment more multilateral? And specifically, how do you intend to address the problem of South Korean firms supplying China with alternatives to U.S. semiconductor equipment, technology, and supply chains?
Thank you, Congressman. If I may, maybe I'll take the second part of the question, because I think that one's in my lane, and maybe my colleague can take the first part of your question, if that's all right. Yeah, we are always on the lookout for violations of our rules, and we aggressively investigate. I have agents across the country in 30 different locations. We always want to make sure that we are enforcing our laws so that we are not putting American companies at a disadvantage and that we're maintaining an even playing field. I can't speak specifically to any particular law enforcement investigation, but what I can tell you, that wouldn't be proper under our longstanding principles, but what I can tell you is it's something that we take seriously and
is generally recognized and you understand it's happening, correct? You would agree with that it's happening?
Again, I'm at a little bit of a loss of what I can say since I run the law enforcement function, but what I can tell you is when there are reports of violations, we take them seriously and investigate.
Then let's go over to Ms. Kindler, who's on the administrative side. Do you agree that that's happening, what I described for you?
Congressman, effective export controls absolutely require international collaboration, especially in an area like semiconductors where there is technology.
What are you doing to stop these other countries from sending component parts to South Korea that are then getting used in American equipment existing in China?
It is exactly that international collaboration, speaking with other governments, sharing our risk assessments, helping them understand how technology is misused and maybe used against our own interests, our own national
Is anything
security.
actually being done to stop it besides just providing information that's going on? Are you guys working to stop it?
Congressman, it is exactly that collaboration that does work to stop the flow of goods. In the Russia context, building the Global Export Control Coalition is exactly what has stopped us from sending a list of 45 technologies that we've shared around the world with Russia.
I've got a bunch of stuff I want to ask you, so let me ask you about this. Back in May, I asked you about the $300 million penalty for Seagate. I had talked to you guys about that. I think I talked to you, Mr. Axelrod, about that. And then we sent some follow-up questions, and in response to those questions, the answer was that it appears worrisome to me that fines currently imposed on businesses for violations of export control laws may not serve as a sufficient deterrent. I agree with that. So if it is not sufficient, then what else can we do as a punitive matter to stop those parties that are violating our export control?
Sure. I'm proud of the result we achieved in Seagate, and I thought that was an effective penalty. But that we follow the facts and the law. When we have sufficient evidence, we bring criminal charges. When we don't, and we have enough to bring administrative charges, we bring administrative charges. I think both have deterrent value. But I agree, Congressman, nothing deters like having people in jail in handcuffs, and when we are able to make those cases, we bring them with the Department of Justice.
All right. Finally, last week I introduced a bill called the No Technology for Terror Act, which makes permanent the foreign direct product rule to Iran, a measure that was published as a rule in February of this year. This, in my estimation, is necessary to restrict technology that is used to fuel Iran's manufacturing and trade of lethal weapons systems to Russia. Between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, their partnership, of course, we know is growing and becoming more intertwined. I applaud the BIS's efforts to enforce our export control laws to China and other countries whose strategic objectives are contrary to the U.S. national security interests. As our adversaries work more closely, how are you allocating departmental resources between the other regions that are becoming more closely aligned to China? This will be my last question to you, either one.
Congressman, on the international alliance front, we are working very closely with that group of 38 major world economies that I mentioned earlier to bring our controls on Russia into alignment, whether that's through third country shipments or directly to Russia.
All right, thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Now I yield to myself to ask a few questions. Ms. Kendler, do you believe that we should be working to keep American technology out of the hands of the Chinese Communist Party?
Congressman, I very much agree that advanced technology should be kept from being used in Chinese military modernization. Absolutely.
Quantify that term, advanced technology, to you. You said it more specifically than just, yeah, I want everything out of their hands. So quantify that.
Sure. There are technologies that are very useful for military modernization that would allow the Chinese military to outpace that of the United States. We do not permit that technology to go to China. There are other technologies that are low level that may not, that the United States does not have a advantage in, that are available all around the world, including in China itself. And those technologies, there may be a values-based reason, a human rights reason to control a technology like that, but for the most part, such controls would not be effective were we to impose them.
You agree that if, as I gave an analogy in my opening statement, if one part of China or the Communist Party has the technology or is able to steal or somehow garner the information or the technology, then the whole of the Chinese government has the technology? Would you agree with that?
I do believe that there are instances in which end users will put compliance measures in place that are reliable, particularly when it comes to multinationals operating in China.
To be more specific, you're saying right now you don't agree with what I just said. You believe that China has compliance measures in place that would prevent one part of the Chinese Communist Party from getting something that the other part of the Chinese Communist Party has?
If you're specifically speaking about items that may be in the possession of the Chinese government, that's a bit different from the overall national security concern. The national security concern is different.
I think if it's part of the Chinese Communist Party, the government, a military entity, a private business that's supported by the Chinese Communist Party, whether in the Chinese home or abroad, I would say that the facts support that if one entity at all has a piece of that information, then the whole does as well. But I want to move on a little bit from that and move back to the conversation my friend Mr. Mills was having with you about IFS on the entity list. And can you just tell, for the benefit of everybody, why was IFS put on the entity list? To restrict them from getting anything?
Congressman, this is...
Explicitly, clearly, why were they put on that list?
Congressman, we identified human rights concerns associated with IFS, and that led to their designation on the entity list. This is before my time, but that is my understanding based on the public record.
Could either of you give me something more specific?
May we get back to you with further information on that?
You may. I see some folks behind you raising their hand. I would actually give them about 20 seconds to say something if they want. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. As we look at that and those accusations, what can you tell us you were concerned about reaching the IFS? What technology did you not want to make it to the IFS?
Congressman, we are concerned about human rights, and we are concerned about the fentanyl crisis. And when we are talking about the removal of IFS from the entity list, all of these factors came into play in a tough decision.
I get it, but what did you not want to get to the IFS? You put them on the entity list. You didn't want them to have something. What did you not want them to have, and what will they now have access to as a result of being removed from that list? You said there's a balance in national security, balancing fentanyl, balancing what they've done with Uyghurs or with anything else. Tell us the other side of that balance.
When a company is added to the entity list, it means that we have scrutiny. We have a ability to review transactions involving that entity that we did not previously have. We can review all items going to that entity and determine, based on the technical nature, who it's going to, how it will be used, and the risk of diversion to other activities that may be unauthorized. We assess all of those factors together with DOD, Energy, and State.
What didn't you want them to have?
Well, that is a decision for the interagency that would come in as each license application comes in. We care very much about human rights, and I know that's a shared concern. And so we would look at license applications with that angle.
We're going to do another round, so I'm going to yield to my friend, Mr. Crow here, and then I'll go back down the line here. But Mr. Crow, you're recognized for
Thank
5
you.
minutes if you wish.
I wanted to talk about the issue of resourcing, because the economy has grown significantly in the last decade. Your resourcing has been flat, as I mentioned in my opening. And at the same time as the economy has grown, your budget and resources have remained flat. The national security environment has changed radically, right? We've had some discussions in the past about how the battlefield has changed drastically, and we see that in Ukraine, for example, where more and more technologies and things that we're seeing in the battlefield are commercial off the shelf. Drones, night vision, scopes, all manner of radios, all manner of technology that is no longer just the domain of defense companies or governments, but is stuff you could go on Amazon and buy. So given that, given both the growth in the economy and the radical shift in national security and what conflict looks like today, can you tell me what is it you would do if you had more resources? How would you use those resources, and what would it look like? But both of you, just a minute and a half each.
Congressman, thank you very much. Our mission is harder and more complex given the evolving technology space, given the evolving national security geopolitical landscape. We punch above our weight in BIS. I think your assessment of our budget is accurate, and we've at the same time issued dozens more rulemakings. We've put together this coalition on Russia and built and maintained it. We have a vigorous expansion.
What would you do with more resources?
I think I'd start with the Office of International Policy and building up technical analysis of the emerging technologies. We'd put more resources into that. We'd put more resources into licensing so that we can be provide a faster response in reviewing license applications while committing the same efforts to protecting national security and foreign policy interests. We would beef up the resources we relied upon for open source information in foreign languages.
Why? What impact would that have? What would that allow you to do?
It would enable us to better protect national security, period. But more specifically, it would enable us to look at what other countries' adversaries are publishing in their own materials about their goals, where they're spending their sovereign wealth, how they are investing in technologies in a way that may not be clear if you just follow US sources or English language sources. It would also enable us to develop controls more carefully in collaboration with international partners and allies to spend the resources in foreign capitals, bringing those Representative Moran alluded to Korea earlier, bringing other countries on board with our controls so that we truly have effective controls where there is foreign availability of technology that we're concerned about.
Thank you, Mr. Axelrod.
For us, three things. More agents. I mentioned the Disruptive Technology Strike Force. We'd be able to put more agents against doing investigations, particularly involving China and Russia. Second, more analysts. We don't currently have enough analysts to have them embedded in our field offices around the country. If we had more resources, we would make sure that each of our field offices had an analyst working there alongside the agents. And third, we'd invest in technology tools. One way to magnify the efficiency and effectiveness of the people we do have is through technology. If we had more resources, we could buy some of those technology tools to allow us to do our work smarter.
I appreciate that. If you had those three, if you did those three things, what would be the real life impact?
Sure, more investigations, more charges, more penalties, more compliance checks, more additions to the entity list, all things that I think would enhance our national security.
Why is that important? Why are more investigations, more penalties? Why is that important?
So two reasons. One, it holds people accountable who've broken our laws and who've hurt our national security, but I think or more importantly, it has a huge ripple effect, and it has a huge deterrence effect. To encourage companies to invest in compliance, you have to also, every once in a while, hold companies accountable when they violate the law. That's what encourages them to spend the money up front, and we would much rather have companies comply on the front end than enforce on the back end, because when we're enforcing on the back end, it means the national security harm has already happened.
Well, certainly we've seen with an instance of Russia that, it's one thing to impose the sanctions, but sanctions are, living beings almost. You always have to be monitoring, looking at what loopholes are being exploited. Our adversaries are constantly evolving, and to your point, we have to constantly be evolving and enforcing and having eyes on that as well. Is that fair to say?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. I do find the answers interesting of what would be done with more resources to add more investigations and more to the entity list, when we were literally having the conversation about one of the primary focuses of the entity list being taken off the entity list. So it's interesting to juxtapose those two things. Representative Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd also add that sanctions only work when they're actually properly enforced. And as we can see, this administration has done nothing to continue to enforce the sanction against Iran, which is why they have more petroleum export at this time than they ever had throughout their history, which is actually helping to funnel into the funding of other terrorist organizations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, Kataib Hezbollah, Houthis, So sanctions only work when they're actually being enforced. I want to go back to something that you had stated a few moments ago, Ms. Kindler, and I'm not trying to pick on you on this one, but I'm just curious. You know, you say, and I'm quoting you, we are concerned with human rights and national security, yet the very country who poses the greatest threat to us from a national security perspective, the very country which commits tremendous amounts of human rights, and I would even wager to say genocide, is actually the Chinese government themselves. And yet we're actually scared under the Biden administration to call them adversaries. We still try and refer to them as competitors because we don't want to upset the great ruler Xi. That's the realities here. You want to talk about genocide and human rights violations? Chinese government. And you try to distinguish between the two from the PRC to the CCP, but the same guy who heads both is the same guy. So I think it's hard to ignore that. Everyone is so nervous about the ideas of decoupling away from them because they realize that America has not done themselves any favors by continuing to ingratiate themselves with adversarial reliance on our supply chain mechanism. And meanwhile, we'll sit here and say, we care about national security, we care about human rights, but then go and spend and build the economy of a dictator and a nation who actually violates both. I'm sorry, I've got a big issue with that. So I want to go back to IFS because, again, I don't feel that we're actually hitting on this right. Because IFS and the National Narcotics Laboratory are co-located, the Chinese government has repeatedly and aggressively claimed that both entities were on the entity list, despite multiple clarifications, by the way, from the U.S. government that this wasn't true. To the best of your understanding, did the Chinese government condition their re-engagement with the U.S. on counter-narcotics efforts on IFS being removed from the entity list?
Congressman, if I may, no Commerce Department in history has been more aggressive towards China and export controls than this.
I'd agree under the Trump administration, but not now. Because I've watched actually the opposite. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and I'm fine that you got back onto this topic because I'm all for it, they've been geopolitically aligned for decades, and we've ignored it. That's why Russia and China both modified their constitution so they can stay in power forever, so they can actually go after the US dollar as the global currency. The whole idea was to focus on Western Hemisphere attacks on economics and resource and supply chain base. But yet when we support their allies, we in turn indirectly support them as well, which is why I brought up Iran earlier, which is why I bring up the marriage of convenience of Russia with the Chavez of Venezuela or Pedro in Colombia, or the economic coercion that goes on in Panama and Honduras that actually allows them to control the taxation and tariffs of the Panama Canal, or the Belt and Road Initiative expansion that takes over Eurasian expansion, Africa, Oceania, so they control Western Hemisphere supply chain through the Red Sea, Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Horn of Africa, the Persian Gulf. Let's go on and on with this. No, the Biden administration has not been more aggressive against China. They've actually been weaker. And I think that when you look at exportation, which is simple data numbers, it speaks to that and its inevitability. That we are not becoming a nation which is decoupling from adversaries, we're actually becoming more reliant upon, and especially as we attack natural gas and our own ability to provide energy, which, by the way, I would argue is truly the global currency as energy output. So I disagree with your assertion there, and I think it's, just look at the numbers, look at the figures on this, and I think that everyone can actually go with this. But my question goes back to it. Did the Chinese government condition their re-engagement of U.S. counter-narcotic efforts on IFS being removed from the entity list?
Congressman, as I believe my colleague noted, that we were of the clear understanding that this was an impediment to their cooperation on the fentanyl precursors.
So did the Chinese then say, if you don't remove IFS, or if you, I guess if I should say, if IFS is removed, that would have a implication on this re-engagement?
Congressman, all I can tell you is that it was clear to us that removal of this entity from the entity list would lead to cooperation on fentanyl precursors, and that is a national security
So we allow
priority
China to now
of the
drive
United States.
what goes on and off our entity list based on what type of engagement they will or will not have with us?
The decision of who to remove from the entity list is made by the Departments of Defense, Commerce, Energy, and State unanimously.
You know, that's funny to me. I mean, this would be the equivalent, and I just saw that. So If, for example, China automatically says that we're going to support you in climate change, does that mean that we just drop Huawei as well? I mean, this is the dangerous precedence that we set when we start engaging these ways where foreign entities say, we won't engage with you unless you do X. And we go ahead and acquiesce to these each time. And my colleague can talk about the fact that I utilize the term acquiesce, but when we do that, I'm going to call it for what it is. So I'm sorry, but I didn't realize that we were actually serving the People's Republic of China as opposed to the United States and the people who are citizens here and what the best interests are here. But if you want to talk about human rights and national security, then start looking at the decoupling away from China in its entirety. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Moran, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pick up where Representative Mills just left off because there's been a lot of questions about IFS and China, and I want to be sure that I understand what the answers are, because earlier, Ms. Kindler, when you started talking about why IFS, those export controls were no longer being imposed, you said that China had undertaken, quote, major tangible action to address the fentanyl precursors, and that's why now we're playing nice with them effectively. But then later, I thought Mr. Axelrod said that they didn't actually change their behavior. So just want to figure out, did I miss that? Did I misunderstand that? Was there major tangible action by China to address the fentanyl precursors?
Yes, Congressman. What I said or meant to say was that IFS wasn't removed because of a change in IFS's behavior. There was a change in behavior by the overall Chinese government.
Okay, so all right. So by the Chinese government, when did this behavior change, and do we have any measurable results from it to see whether or not there's actually been a decrease of the fentanyl precursors flowing through Mexico to the U.S.?
Yeah, all of this happened within the past month, Congressman. I think it's too early for those types of details, but that's something we can try to look into as time goes on.
And you actually walked right into the point I'm trying to make. You said it was too early, basically, to see whether or not there's any results from this changed behavior effectively.
Well, I think it's too early to see, to track overall sort of fentanyl flows into the United States. That's not my area of expertise, but my understanding is there have been concrete actions taken by the Chinese government so far, and that should lead to a reduction. But in terms of actual concrete numbers, I don't know. But my understanding is that the Chinese government has already taken action that has led to some companies stopping operations.
Okay. But we don't have any real data about whether or not what the Chinese have promised to do or not has had any positive effect on the fentanyl trade here in the United States yet. We've removed IFS from the entity list, and is that correct? We're basically taking China's word for it to say they promise they're going to be good stewards and they're going to be good partners with us, and as a result, we're going to go ahead and remove IFS from the entity list.
Congressman, I'm not sure. I don't think I'd put it that way. What I would say is there were a series of actions taken at the same time. China did a bunch of things. The United States did a thing. The United States removed IFS from the entity list because, as I've said before, it was an impediment to getting China's cooperation on fentanyl, which is killing over 100,000 Americans every year in all of your districts, right? In across the country. We have to do what we can. That doesn't mean that we're going to trust China's going to do what they say.
No, but that's exactly what you did. No. That's exactly what the government did, was they trusted China on their word. Why don't we see the results of that first before we remove IFS from the entity list? I understand that you've got to make a horse trade at some points, and I really understand, being a representative from Texas, the fentanyl trade and how it's affected and impacted communities. We are in a border state, so I see it day in and day out. But I think what I have a big problem with is saying to China, hey, you know what, we're going to go ahead and give you what you want first before we see the results on the back end. I think we ought to ask for results on the front end, and then if we needed to make that trade later, precondition it on the decline of those fentanyl precursors. We haven't seen that yet. Yet we have taken IFS off the list, and ostensibly, I'm willing to bet IFS will not go back on that list, even if the fentanyl precursors do not go down.
Well, Congressman, first of all, as I said before, there's no like lifetime pass, depending on circumstances. A removal, generally speaking, a removal from the entity list doesn't guarantee you'll never go back on. But what I would say is China has taken concrete actions. Of course, we'll continue to monitor to see how effective those actions are. But so far, they've done the things they said they would do. And that doesn't mean that that's going to continue forever. But so far, it's not like it was just buying a pig in a poke.
This is going to be a point for us to come back to at a later date. Just like I revisited a topic I raised in May, I'm going to revisit this again because time will only tell whether or not those precursors go down. And I think we're going to look like we have egg on our face if we have given China what they wanted and we have not gotten the results that Americans deserve in return.
I agree that time will tell, Congressman. What I'm saying is I think we had to try. Given the scope of the fentanyl crisis in America, we had to try to see if this could work. And so far, there have been concrete actions by the Chinese side.
Yeah, my colleague, Mr. Mills, has it right. If we'll just close the border, we'll do a lot more for the fentanyl problem than if we make deals with China. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 more minutes. Looking at fentanyl as an issue, and as individuals that deal with it peripherally as a part of the subject related to export controls, asking for your own assessments. How much do you assess, having looked at this, that China could have a small effect on the amount of fentanyl coming into America, a fair effect on it, a substantially large effect on the amount of fentanyl coming into America?
I mean, Congressman,
It's the bang for the buck.
yeah, we're a little bit beyond our subject matter expertise since we're mostly focused on things going out of the country, not things coming into the country. What I can tell you is that, as I said before, the steps that were taken here to remove one party, an important party, because of the human rights abuses involving the Uyghurs, which is something we take very seriously. There are a number of other entities that we've placed on the entity list for that same reason, that remain on the entity list. But the removal of one entity, which has removed this impediment to allow this cooperation on fentanyl precursors to begin, is significant. Now,
The whole argument is that, by removing them from the entity list, we can make a substantial dent because China will be willing to stymie the flow of fentanyl into America. And so I'm asking, what's the bang for the buck? Does the Chinese government, in your agency's assessment, have an iron fist in the control? And right now they're like, yeah, send that stuff into America. We don't care. We want to see it happen. Or they're like, man, I really wish we could do something about that, but we just can't figure out a way to do it. Which one are they?
Well, Congressman, what I would tell you is that the Chinese government has taken concrete actions so far, but we will continue to monitor to see what the impact is.
So they could have done it with or without IFS being removed from the entity list.
That's could have or would have are two separate things.
No doubt about it. We can cover that too.
Well,
They certainly were not willing, right?
Certainly we're not willing.
All right. I think it's just a good point to make about the entity that it is that we're dealing with. I want to go back to something that we were discussing on this front. Ma'am, you couldn't necessarily say what it is that we wanted to prevent them from getting. I didn't get an answer in that. Let me try asking this in a slightly different way. Do you know what it is that they want by being taken off the entity list? That's the other side of that coin. What do you assess that they want? Before I would make any deal, I would want to know what my counterpart wants. Why do they want that? Why do they want to be off that entity list? What are they trying to get their hands on? So what's the other side of that coin?
Congressman, we certainly have some understanding of that. I don't know that this is exactly the forum to speak about that in. Our approach here is to look at human rights and protection of human rights in China through a wide variety of tools, and this specific entity listing
So
is
allow me to
just one
pause for
of
one
those
moment then.
pieces.
Pause for, can we just turn off the camera and ask everybody to leave so they can answer us? I was wondering if we could turn off the camera and just ask everybody to leave so that you would answer us, but I'm told that we can't just simply do that. Please continue.
Congressman, when it comes to human rights and our export controls, we have technologies that we control for what we call crime control reasons, which is another word of saying human rights reasons. Those technologies cannot go to China. We have technologies that are used, such as advanced intelligence technology. You know, our rule that we put out last fall and updated this fall, that advanced technology, artificial intelligence technology, that's what entities use to process the DNA information that they harvest. And we have
Let me
controlled
pause you
that.
in my remaining time, and thank you for trying to answer the question. Just to kind of sum up what I'm getting out of this right now. We can't say what it is exactly that we were preventing them from getting. We know they wanted to be off the entity list, that specific agency. And there's something that you could maybe tell me in another setting about what it is that they were trying to get their hands on. But the reality is they do now have a greater potential to get there, if not an unlimited potential to get their hands on whatever it is that they wanted that was being prevented by being on the entity list, that was important enough for them to say, we will do all of this on fentanyl that we were not doing before, even though it was killing millions of people. That to them made it a good deal. So there is something in there. And I would hope that we find another time to get those answers behind closed doors, because I am damn curious to know what that something is. In that, I've exceeded my time. I'm going to now go to Representative Issa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up with a rhetorical question, not about something that's so valuable, but I want to ask it in a different way. Recently, we were embarrassed by going to China and having them demonstrate their 7-micron capability and their 5G functional units, just to in your face. They don't, either they don't need us or they've gotten what they need from us. If we continue at this pace, is there any doubt but that they will in fact be at least at parity or dominant in 5G and other emerging technologies?
Congressman, our controls on China, export controls are intended to massively slow down technology acquisition. We are not...
Well, they're not slowed. They demonstrated that they're going to be parallel with us in 5G at this point.
I would argue that the 7-nanometer chip in the Huawei phone, which of course we share your concerns about this technological development. First of all, purported 7-nanometer, the performance may not match the market.
The yield may not match.
The scale, no, neither performance nor yield may match the marketing of the device. Moreover, the semiconductor chip that is inside that phone is of poorer performance than what they had years ago. So our export controls are meaningful in slowing China's advanced technology acquisition. And as we stay on top and proactive about how we institute our controls to match our national security and foreign policy interests, we will keep them behind and we will not allow them to outpace U.S. performance.
What authorities don't you have that you would like to have? Congress can give you greater authority. What is it you don't have?
I really appreciate that question. We do have broad authority through ECRA and additional authorities were provided in the NDAA last year that are very useful to us. One area where we're looking in this regard is cloud computing. And this particularly pertains to access to cloud computing that is no longer indigenously or domestically available in China because of our controls.
Why worry about making AI when you can get the fruit of AI for your development online?
Precisely, sir. So it is possible that we may need additional authority in that space to protect our national security, and we will absolutely look forward to working with you.
So currently, there is no firewall of AI, and they are free to rent time essentially to their benefit?
It is a concern. Certainly, companies are looking at it not just from a business perspective, but also from a national security perspective, and we're grateful for that. But it may be a space where we need additional authority.
Let me ask you one more question that is not classic BIS, but it does fall under the broader commerce umbrella. The undersecretary at the PTO, in fact, controls whether or not patents are granted and can be enforced in this country, at least in part, in harmony with our legislation and the courts. Currently, Chinese companies, if I'm correct, 3 of the top 10 recipients in volume are Chinese companies, including Huawei, who is now in the top 10. So Huawei, who can't sell here, in fact, has more IP protection and thus more licensing of U.S. companies, often reciprocal licensing or often even global worldwide licensing that give them access to technology. If you had tools that made it clear that in return for their wanton theft of intellectual property, we would in fact retaliate by limiting their patentability and their revenue from here, would that be valuable to you? And I'm saying it broadly because it's not just your lane, but the lane of several parts of the government currently not in law. And I say it because every time we have a discussion like this, we talk about their theft of intellectual property. Sometimes as, national security, sometimes just the fact that they steal everything. And our patents, if you waste your time and money, as I did, to patent in China, are useless. To trademark in China is useless. So would that authority work together to make sure it passes international muster? Would that authority help you in stemming this advance they're making?
Congressman, I absolutely share your concerns about Huawei and theft of intellectual property. As a former prosecutor of Huawei, that's certainly part of our allegations against the company in the Eastern District of New York. The questions about patents, unfortunately, as they don't exactly pertain to export controls, that is something I can take back for our PTO administrator.
The ultimate export to China seems to be money. So what we're talking about is the revenue that they receive from licensing here, and even injunctive relief if you don't take a license. Well, in fact, the fruit of that is often, in at least part, the theft of our intellectual property, as a litigator you are well aware of. So if you take that back, I'd love to hear more about it. We are, all of us, trying to figure out in an AI world how you apply the historic export controls, because it's not going to be chips. It's going to be learning capability in the near future. And as you said, right now you don't have that authority in the four square. Thank you, and thanks for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Before I recognize Mr. Crow for a closing statement, I just have one last administrative request. Ms. Kendler, would you commit to providing the licensing data for IFS since being put on the entity list and a briefing about IFS in a classified setting?
Congressman, we certainly want to cooperate with this committee and will fulfill requests that we receive that are consistent with ECRA, absolutely.
So yes?
Consistent with our legal obligations, yes.
Does that mean you are, or I'm just a simple soldier?
ECRA establishes certain rules for how requests are transmitted, and I want to make sure that we are complying with them. But in the spirit of that, absolutely, sir.
Thank you. There's an old saying, don't bullshit a bullshitter. So in that, Mr. Crow, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Are you calling yourself a bullshitter? Is that what you're saying?
I would call.
That's what I took from that.
I would call all 435 people on the.
I'm still in shock. I need to come up with something else to say. I don't know what to say.
And the 100 people on the other side of the Capitol building I would absolutely call every single one of them bullshitters.
That was a rhetorical question. I've known you long enough to know the answer to that.
But you should know if you ask me a question, I'm going to give an answer to it.
That's true.
So don't threaten me with a good time.
That is true. Well, thank you, Chairman Mast. I appreciate you calling this important hearing, and thanks to both of the witnesses for being here today and having this really important discussion. A few takeaways from me. One is the issue of resourcing, that the landscape has dramatically shifted. The economy has increased significantly, and yet a practical flat line of your budgets do not put us in a good position to gain the insight that we need to gain for both our economy and our national security as to how technologies are shaping the battlefield, how technologies are impacting our economic security and our national security, and enforcement. That we just need more agents, and it's one thing having more eyes and insight, it's another thing is doing something about that. And as you both outlined today, the enforcement is the critical long pole in the tent, as I sometimes say, to making sure this actually works, because you can sanction people all day long, you can add people to the entity list, but unless there's actual viable enforcement and we have the resources to do that, people won't take it seriously. Our own companies won't take it seriously, and certainly our adversaries won't either. So it's our responsibility in Congress to have a very serious discussion about how we provide you with the resources to actually conduct the job and perform the mission that you have been asked to do by Congress and by the administration. And the second is the issue of trade-offs, right? That we live in a very complicated world, and sometimes, you know, the soundbite culture that politicians live in doesn't capture the nuance of these trade-offs. Very hard decisions have to be made, right? When we're dealing with national security and export of critical technologies that could be used against U.S. forces, that could be used against our partners, our allies, we certainly take that very seriously. And at the same time, when you have a situation where fentanyl is killing, as you both acknowledged, over 100,000 Americans every year in all of our communities, figuring out how we address both of those sometimes means that we have to make decisions about that enforcement in those relationships. I will leave it to you all, though, to come back to us, and we're going to pull a thread on this. We're not going to stop on this, is the actual enforcement and compliance with IFS delisting, right? I have a lot of trust in this administration to balance that trade-off the right way, but obviously we have independent obligations as members of Congress, not just the trust, but to follow up and conduct oversight. And I really do want to know whether or not China is complying with the terms of the agreement, whether we are getting the bang for the buck on that delisting, and that it actually is resulting in material changes in the precursor flow to the United States that is killing so many of our constituents. So we will certainly be following up with that. So thank you both for coming and having this discussion with us today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. Committee stands adjourned.
All right, thanks, man.
Good to see you.